Hi, Dumi, facilitator of the Shift the Power UK Funders Collective, and these are elements of shifting power that I have learnt, observed over almost 2 years of conversations on a weekly basis with the co-conveners of the collective. The first, timelines and expectations being social constructs. I think in a world where business as usual, M&E indicators, budgets and planning, it obviously makes a lot of sense in that there are certain expectations that need to be met. But I think the pandemic has taught us that the shadow pandemic of misinformation, the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence are very real, and that there is a perspective of an unseen, invisible economy, and that is the care economy, where care work has to be exercised at individual, institutional, community, and even at support structure levels. And I think it's important for us to recognize how a lot of work expectations, infrastructure, can be ableist and exclusionary. And I think this is important for us to recognize in acknowledging the humanity and affirming that we do come with variant forms of struggle, trauma, and many other elements that can be very capitalist within the context of BIPOC diverse individuals that have to consistently, be doing the work of educating, calling out, calling in, and so forth. There is only one human race. I think Toni Morrison said it best in speaking about how there is no such thing as race. And that skin color isn't race. And what I love about this is that, at least for me, it means that there's a different level of engagement that you have and understanding. So amidst all the arguments and amidst all the, instances of white supremacy, that you can be able to pick your battles, one. Secondly, that you can rest and not be so frustrated. And then third, that you're operating from a very different level of intellect, one that doesn't always need to be amongst the muddy, messy, ugly, and often harmful. And I think for me, this brought about a lot of understanding in anti-racist work, recognizing that it is a distraction. Equity lies in reversing hierarchies. I think there have been many examples where people have spoken about equitable participation, but more importantly, how it can be co-opted, weaponized, and folks patting themselves on the back because they've got certain, individuals within their advisory group, steering committees, and board membership. But I think the real litmus test is in the employment figures. The real litmus test is in deploying and applying resources to the work that needs to be done, and not just in community representation, not just in, D&I, but really in the decision making, in where capital is deployed. Doing the work. Doing the work is important because many people, have asked, how do we find these kinds of individuals? Where do we find these organizations? Oh, we thought that this organization was the easiest because they were quite visible. No, a lot of people are not in your networks. And I love that, one person shared this at the Global Period Poverty Forum about 3 weeks ago, where they did mention that, it was often very difficult to find researchers and, BIPOC researchers in that specific field. And someone did actually remind them to say, you need to extend yourself. Those folks are not part of your normative standard and, public networks, that there are barriers to participation. If not language, it could be jurisdiction, it could be, social class, or even recognizing that people are not part of certain alumni. And so I think it's important in doing the work. This is not just limited to reaching out to the underserved and non-recognized and those who are outside of your proximity. It's also in recognizing that you don't want to be in an environment where you're being called out. It obviously makes a lot of sense for you to be doing the work by investigating, by figuring out. Google works in many instances. Equality lies in anti-poverty work. I think to a large extent, when we recognize that a lot of people don't have social protections, that a lot of people as a result of not having the means, cannot always rest, cannot always, for instance, take leave, in being a founder of an institution or an organization. And so I think it's important to recognize that for for real, never mind equity, I really want to say equity, but for equitable participation, we have to address elements of poverty, and that poverty can be quite invisible, and that in many instances, especially for folks who don't want to be stripped away of their dignity and who don't want to have to perform struggle, that it won't always be very easy to, recognize that they're underemployed, that they're not necessarily paid, and that they don't have safeguards against adverse personal, emotional, and other events. And so I think it's really critical for us to do that kind of work in recognizing the invisible. Lastly, it's entrusting in the process. I think in recognizing that, we can do all the work, we can try as much as possible to publish statements, to do the research, but I think when we are to engage BIPOC, othered, underserved, and often erased, excluded individuals, we have to trust in the process. We have to recognize that these individuals might not necessarily come from the same schools or have the same understanding and framing and theory within the a development industrial complex. But however, the very emphasis or the very basis of shifting power is an entrusting, right? In that these individuals, were forcibly displaced, that there's intergenerational harm, that there are elements that of control that were taken and stripped away from their communities. And the reality is that they have the solutions. They know what needs to be done. They know and understand how to care and be custodians of the planet. And so I think it's only apt and important for them for them to be allowed to thrive, for them to be allowed to really, really enjoy the journey, to be honest. So it's not necessarily about the end goal of decriminalization. It's about helping individuals to exercise agency, autonomy, and really thrive throughout the process, whether in having to be resilient or whether in having, to care for others or whether in having to serve community. I think it's important for us to recognize that there's so much out there and that shifting power really is multifaceted, and that it's rooted in consistently doing the work, spending the time, having the conversations, creating the space, and trying to shift some of the levers in your own areas of influence. Thank you.